Ethan Miller was a 17-year-old boy who loved the simple joys of life. He was the kind of teenager every parent dreamed of, a hard-working student with a bright smile that could light up any room. Ethan lived with his father, Richard Miller, in a quiet suburb outside the city. His mother had passed away when he was a child, leaving Richard to raise him alone. Despite the loss, Ethan grew up kind-hearted and full of life. Richard, on the other hand, was a private man. To his neighbors, he was just a widowed mechanic who kept to himself. But there was something about him, a quiet intensity, a mystery he kept locked away. That Friday evening started like any other. Ethan had just finished basketball practice and was walking home, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He had promised his dad they'd have pizza night, and he was excited to watch a movie together. He stopped by a convenience store to grab some snacks. He didn't notice the three men loitering near the alley next to the store. The men were part of a gang that controlled the area. Marcus, the leader, was tall and intimidating, with a scar running down his cheek. His two lackeys, Joey and Trey, were just as dangerous. They spotted Ethan the moment he walked into the store. To them, he looked like an easy target, a young, innocent kid they could scare into handing over money. As Ethan stepped out of the store, Marcus called out to him, "Hey kid, got a minute?" Ethan turned around, unsure if they were talking to him. Yeah," he said hesitantly. Marcus grinned, a menacing smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We need some cash. Hand over your wallet and no one gets hurt." Ethan's face paled. I don't have much, just a few dollars for snacks." Joey stepped forward, his voice mocking. "Oh, come on, don't make this hard, kid." Ethan clutched his backpack tighter. "I don't want any trouble. Please, just let me go." But Marcus wasn't in the mood to let him go. "You think you can walk away from us?" he snarled. The situation escalated quickly. Ethan tried to run, but Trey grabbed him and slammed him against the wall. Ethan struggled, his voice pleading, "Please, I didn't do anything." Joey pulled out a knife. "You should have just listened, kid." The gang didn't stop to think. In a frenzy of violence, they stabbed Ethan and left him bleeding in the alley. Marcus wiped the blade on his shirt and muttered, "Let's get out of here." Ethan lay there, the life draining out of him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his dad asking when he'd be home. Back at home, Richard was setting the table. He glanced at the clock, wondering why Ethan was late. He sent another text, but there was no reply. A feeling of unease crept over him. Richard was a man who trusted his instincts, and right now they were screaming at him. He grabbed his keys and headed out to look for Ethan. As he drove towards the basketball court, his mind raced with possibilities. Ethan wasn't the kind of kid to wander off without telling him. When Richard spotted the flashing lights of a police car near the convenience store, his heart sank. He parked and ran towards the commotion, pushing past the small crowd that had gathered. And then he saw him, Ethan, his boy, lying motionless on a stretcher. The world seemed to stop. Richard felt a wave of emotion, grief, rage, and something darker. The paramedic tried to explain, but Richard wasn't listening. His hands trembled as he brushed Ethan's hair from his forehead. He looked at his son's face, so young, so full of promise, and felt something inside him break. Richard wasn't always a mechanic. Before Ethan was born, he had a past, a violent one. He had been a trained operative in a secret military program, skilled in combat, espionage, and, most importantly, killing. When his wife died, he left that life behind to raise his son. He promised himself he would never go back. But now, looking at Ethan's lifeless body, that promise meant nothing. The police assured Richard they would investigate, but he knew better. He had seen their kind before, well-meaning but ineffective against men like Marcus and his gang. That night, Richard sat in his garage, staring at an old trunk he hadn't opened in years. Inside were the tools of his former life: knives, guns, disguises, and documents. He pulled out a black notebook and began writing down everything he learned from the crime scene. The police might take weeks to find the gang, but Richard wouldn't wait. The next morning, Marcus and his gang were in their hideout, laughing about what they had done. They didn't know who Ethan's father was. They didn't know the storm that was coming. Richard started with Trey. He tracked him down to a bar on the outskirts of town. Trey didn't even see him coming. Richard dragged him into the alley and made him talk. The information came quickly: names, locations, plans. Trey begged for mercy, but Richard didn't believe in mercy anymore. One by one, Richard hunted them down. Joey was next, followed by Marcus. By the time the police realized what was happening, Richard had dismantled the gang piece by piece. He left no evidence, no witnesses, and no mercy. The story ends not with triumph, but with silence. Richard returned home, a man forever changed. He stood in Ethan's room, looking at the photos of his son on the walls. For a moment, he thought he could hear Ethan's laughter, but the house was quiet now, and Richard knew it always would be. He sat on the bed, clutching a photo of Ethan, and whispered, "I'm sorry, son. I couldn't protect you." And in the darkness, Richard Miller wept for his son, for himself, and for the man he had become. He thought he was done with the world, that nothing mattered anymore. The loss of his son had left a void too vast to fill, and the blood on his hands felt like chains pulling him into an abyss. But the world had other plans for Richard. A week after the gang's destruction, Richard received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message. "Your work hasn't gone unnoticed. We need someone like you." It included a phone number and the insignia of a secret government agency he thought he had left behind forever. Richard sat in silence, staring at the note. His past had caught up with him, but this time he didn't feel dread. He felt purpose. Ethan was gone, but maybe his skills could save someone else's child. Perhaps this was his chance to turn his pain into something meaningful. He dialed the number. Within days, Richard found himself in a secure briefing room, surrounded by officials. They spoke of threats that needed men like him, men who could operate in the shadows, take down criminal empires, and protect innocent lives. Richard listened, his face expressionless, but inside something stirred. For years he had suppressed this side of himself, convinced it had no place in his life as a father. But now, with Ethan gone, the tools of violence felt like a means to an end, not an end in themselves. The agency's director, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Monroe, studied him carefully. "You're a man who's lost everything," she said. "That makes you dangerous, but it also makes you the best we've got. Are you in?" Richard nodded. "I'm in, but I have conditions." "What are they?" Catherine asked. "No children harmed, no innocents touched, and when I'm done, I walk away for good." She extended her hand. "Deal." Richard's first mission was in Eastern Europe, dismantling a trafficking ring that had been eluding international authorities for years. He moved with precision, his grief sharpening his focus. Every criminal he brought down felt like a small measure of justice for Ethan. His methods were ruthless, but his intent was clear. He was fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Word of his efficiency spread quickly within the agency. Richard became a legend, the man who could take on entire networks of criminals without leaving a trace. But despite his success, he never forgot Ethan. Every night, he carried his son's photo in his pocket, whispering, "This is for you." One day, after a particularly grueling mission, Catherine visited Richard. "You've done more in 6 months than most agents do in a lifetime," she said, "but I can see it's taking a toll." Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked out the window, his face weary. "What I do, it doesn't bring him back." "No," Catherine said softly, "but it saves others. That has to count for something." Over time, Richard began mentoring younger agents, passing on his skills and teaching them the value of restraint. He emphasized the importance of understanding the line between justice and vengeance. "You don't want to become a monster," he'd say. "No matter how much pain you carry, you fight for the living, not the dead." His work earned him admiration and respect, but it was his humanity that made him unforgettable. He became a symbol of hope within the agency, a man who had endured unimaginable loss, yet used it to fuel something greater. Years later, Richard decided it was time to retire. He returned to the quiet suburb where he had raised Ethan. The house was still filled with memories of his son, but now they brought him peace instead of pain. One evening, as he walked through the park where Ethan used to play, a little boy ran up to him and smiled. "Hey, mister, can you help me throw this ball?" Richard crouched down, his face softening. Sure, buddy. As he played catch with the boy, his mother approached. Thank you, she said. It's rare to see people take the time these days. Richard smiled faintly. It's the little things that matter. That night, Richard sat by Ethan's photo and spoke aloud. I've done what I could, son. I've made mistakes, but I've tried to make it right. You taught me that even in the darkest times, there's light to be found. He paused, his voice breaking slightly. I'll carry you with me always, and I'll keep trying to be the man you'd be proud of. Conclusion. Richard's story is one of transformation. Through his pain, he found purpose. Through his loss, he gained strength. He turned his darkest moments into a mission to protect others, proving that even the deepest scars can inspire greatness. The moral of his journey is simple but profound. Hardship doesn't define you, it refines you. Life's struggles are the fires that forge a stronger, wiser soul. And even in the face of tragedy, there is always a way to rise, to make something good from the ashes. That's the story, friends. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a pleasure sharing it with you all. Don't forget to comment below and let me know where you're watching from. It's always fun to see the global reach of these stories. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button for more amazing stories, tips, and tricks. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.